So Rachie's going to speak from Operation Noah, and she'll tell you a little bit about what that is. And her title, which intrigues me hugely, is "What can we learn from five sassy women in Exodus 1 and 2?" So I'm going to hand over to Rachie to talk to us a little bit about some of the theological and biblical imperatives for challenging climate change.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me today. And thanks, Paul, for opening up for me about the Northeast. It's really, that was fascinating. So you only have to scratch the surface, we know, in any conversation on climate breakdown to hear people feel powerless and overwhelmed, really, about the scale and the time frame. And as a coach, which is where I'm coming from personally, I know the disabling effects of feelings on behaviour. If we feel a particular way, we act a particular way. So when we believe in something passionately, you have to couple that with being believed in, okay? And if we have belief in something and we're believed in, then we can do incredible things. We know that. So it's crucial that you and I and the church in general actually help people regain their belief that it's possible to succeed in small and big ways in the climate crisis. Paul's laid that out just now. And if we don't help people change deeply, then we simply will fail at this, because the science isn't what changes people, guys. It's the deeper metanoia change. And that's what has to happen, and the belief they can make a difference. So I believe in the power of coaching and questions to bring about the deep change. And if you watch Jesus, in majority of how he responds to people is he doesn't answer a question with an answer. He answers a question with another question, which is to get ownership. That's the reason he does it. Will you tell me the answer, guys? So this is why I've chosen to use our time together in the way that I have, because I want to allow us to reflect and be changed through the process of this morning. We don't have very long, so that's why I've done it. And I hope also to give you biblical tools to help you speak to other Christians and to get engaged in system change. Because what I hear as a theologian is, hang on, my notes have just disappeared, helpfully. What I hear as a theologian is that people fundamentally don't know why this isn't even an issue. So we're going to spend 15 minutes looking at how the Bible may help us when we think about civil disobedience, our own personal standing up, when it comes to justice. And so I'm going to assume a few things at the beginning. I'm going to assume that we all agree that climate breakdown is a justice issue, that it's deeply unfair, with the poor and least polluting suffering first and worst. The governments are failing to act fast enough, and therefore we must, as churches and individuals, change what we do, but we actually have to agitate for system change. And that's what part of what Operation Noah do. We agitate for divestment in churches and individuals from what their pensions, where they're all stored. So that's why we're coming at it from this point of view. Now, there's an old tale told by a rabbi and a boy. And the lad asked the rabbi why. In Deuteronomy 6:6, it says this: "These commandments I give you today are to be on your hearts." And he says, why are God's commands not supposed to be in our hearts? And the rabbi says, it is because at some point in life, the heart will be cracked open and the truth will drop inside. And so my prayer really is, as you go through these four speakers and your collective contributions, that our hearts break open a little wider, and that the truth about the climate and ecological crisis drops in and changes us, because it matters to God. And when we're changed, then we can change our behavior. I'm going to take us through some narrative theology, which as a theologian and a coach, I adore. We're going to get into the shoes of some people in the passage who faced real challenges, basically so that we can take what they show us, put it inside ourselves, and actually run forward with some confidence. And I've chosen the 5 women in Exodus 1 and 2. I mean, we could have gone with Huldah, we could have gone with a whole range of different ones. But this is because this is the first, I think, the first example of non-violent direct action against injustice in the Bible. And we need to be doing non-violent direct action against the injustice that we see. You're probably over familiar with it, so I'm just going to ask you to consciously kind of step back and look at it afresh. Okay. So first up, we meet the 2 midwives. We meet Shiphrah and Puah. And we're told the king of Egypt is trying to kill all the baby boys, and he's asked them to do it. The interesting thing is that Jewish scholars say they're most probably Egyptian women, because they were so therefore they're Egyptian midwives to the Hebrews. They were not Hebrew midwives. And this is really quite significant. Jewish scholars had a list of ancient 20 non-Jewish pious women, and Shiphrah and Puah are on that list, which kind of makes sense, doesn't it? I always thought, why is Pharaoh asking the Hebrews to kill the Hebrews? So that's kind of where we start. So they're Egyptian midwives. But anyway, they overcome their circumstances and upbringing to do what is right. And they show the power of the individual, that's you and me, to overcome societal evil, to actively resist evil and not shirk their responsibilities under the guise of superior orders, okay? They blow apart any of our excuses for cultural norms and the pressures we live under. And this is a shining example that it's possible to rise above, and it is within our grasp. And they had no one to ask advice from, okay? but they followed the order. And so they were clever, cunning and cool, and they didn't play ball. And it says in the text, God sees their bravery and he honors them. And they work together as a pair. It's definitely a united response, which is what the Northeast is doing. It's this brilliant united response. Because they say this, I'm so sorry, these Hebrew boys, they just come so fast, we don't get there. So the question at this point they pose to us is, do we need a buddy to help us in the climate movement hold our nerve? I'm going to challenge you to find role models in the justice movement to emulate them. Read theologians, read Richard Ross, read some of these guys to help keep you on track, to spur you on. Living sustainably is a lot easier if your friends and community are committed to it, which is why we're trying to agitate for churches. So if you change your diet and you're the only one in your family, that's much harder. So we need to get buddies in place. So I think these are the earliest example maybe of NHS workers putting their own lives at risk to save people they didn't even know. They were laying down their lives potentially for the unborn slave. And you don't get much more marginalised than that. So these two midwives saved the lives of future generations. And perhaps Moses, okay, was delivered by them and saved from the first round of deaths. We don't know. But the challenge to us from these is, are we prepared to protect the unborn next generation? They had no idea, guys, if they were saving bullies or beautiful boys. They had absolutely no idea, but they did the right thing at the time they were living in. So we need to let our sacred imaginations wander forward to the lives that we hope to save who haven't been born yet. And are we prepared to use our professions for greater good like they did? What skills do we have? What can we make with our hands? What can we bring to life? Because all of our lives have to be aligned to act justly. So how we earn our living, where we bank, where our pensions are. And I've said to you around Operation Noah, specialism is in that. And for at the moment, 70 million quid from the Church of England is stuck in fossil fuel investments. So Operation Noah agitating to get that sorted. So integration of our lives. And these Egyptian midwives had integration. Next up, we meet Moses' mum, Jochebed, and she was an amazing woman. And this is her refusal. She simply chose to refuse to despair. That was her nonviolent action. She chose to refuse to despair. And that's where some of us might be sitting now. She was living in a time of extreme ethnic cleansing with blood and screams all around the community huts because the baby boys would have been ripped from her friends' arms and thrown into the River Nile as an offering to the river god. And the slave community would have been very, very tight. And into this mess, she gives birth to her third child, the little boy that we know as Moses. And what on earth was she to do facing this cataclysmic mess? Did she ask Amram, her husband? Doesn't say. Would she try to hide Moses, bargain with the soldiers, or perhaps she contemplated killing him because at least she would know where his body was, right, when he was dead? These were hideous choices, and we could have blamed her for panicking or burying her head in the sand. But she doesn't. She holds her nerve. She holds her nerve, and she took matters into her own hands. Despite, guys, the tiny, tiny chance that she would succeed, she took control. She kept her freedom to choose life, no matter that life may have been taken from Moses within minutes of putting her plan into motion. She was taking the little bit of control she had, and she gave him over to God in prayer and trust. And she disobeyed the orders, as we know, that came from the king. She disobeyed orders that came from the king. So she made a coffin, ostensibly, and I cannot imagine the human sorrow and fear that would have threatened to overwhelm her. Her best chance at this point is that a traveling nomad is going to come along, see Moses, pick him up, and take him away forever to a foreign land. This is the best she could humanly hope for. Some of us are sitting in that despair point. You place yourselves in a refugee position, you can understand why our scriptures are so powerful to speak into these tragedies. She feeds him, kisses him, pops him in the floating coffin, and then places him on the river. And then what happens? She leaves. And she places a burden on the shoulders of the little girl, Miriam, Moses' big sister, because Miriam could play in the river and she wouldn't look suspicious. So Jochebed holds her nerve. She does the right thing and leaves the rest to God. And we know the story, how it ends, but she didn't. She went back home and she refused to despair. Now, George Monbiot, for those of you who know him, the journalist, says Christians, he's not a Christian, he says this, Christians are right that despair is a sin because it leads to inaction. It's an inability to move forward. So Jochebed is saying no to despair. And by doing that, she keeps saying moving forward. Today, maybe, my friends, all your act of civil disobedience is to say, no, I will not despair. And when we view the future of the climate, how do we stop falling into despair? How do we keep moving forward? I'm not saying this episode isn't without challenges around what it might mean about God and letting the other babies die and all that. But the point of it is she doesn't despair and she has purposeful action. Then third up is Pharaoh's daughter, Bithia. She comes for her daily wash at a time that daddy would have cleared all the dead babies, because that would have been gross, right? If she'd been washing in the river like that. We see her enter. So does Miriam, whose heart must have been literally leaping out of her chest. And Bithia, as we know, spots the basket. She has it brought to her. And then she opens up the basket. And what does she see? She sees a baby. Okay. At this point, Miriam, I'm sure, thinks that Moses is going to be yanked out and lobbed into the river. But this isn't the case. And what I love is that help comes from the opposite camp. Help comes from the enemy. Bithia was the last person, apart from Pharaoh, that they would have chosen to pick up Moses, because she comes from the seat of power and will take Moses right into the danger zone. And this challenge to us is, do we believe that God can use those opposed to us and opposed to the climate crisis? Do we? Challenging. Do we believe good can come out of evil places of power? Because if we don't, we'll be immobilized in our prayer life. So Bithia knows what her dad's doing and why, and she knows that he's very dangerous. She doesn't see an issue. She doesn't see an issue here. She sees a real flesh and blood baby, and she refuses to follow her father's order, and she says no to his murderous command. Think about it for a minute. She sees the baby in the basket and she chooses from her heart, not her head, to do the right thing. She coos over him and she is resolute, and she refuses to see Moses as a problem to be hidden or ignored. Her heart is open to the other. And the climate crisis is going to determine and demand that we are open to the other, all sorts of other. The challenge to us is, who is other to us that we are not open to as we progress through. She had no power to change her father's overall plans, but she could take responsibility for what choices presented themselves to her, however seemingly insignificant. She saved one baby, one. But what a baby, okay? What a baby. Do we challenge, though, injustice in our own families and churches that may be linked to pension funds, banks, methods of travel, consumption of resources, eating meat? Do we challenge that? Because Bithia is part of this passage, which is to do with the power and the control. Do we challenge those institutions? Do we understand that if we say we can't change the whole system, there's still not an excuse for not doing what's in front of our own faces? Because Bithia could not change the system, but she did what was in front of her own face. And then last up, we meet Moses' sister Miriam, who was watching, waiting, and was ready. She was ready to speak up when the time was right, and she offered a clever solution. And the thing I want you to take away is preparation meeting opportunity is powerful. So Miriam shows extraordinary courage. We know that, a young woman of character and trust in her mother, for one. I mean, I don't know how that conversation went. Miriam, go and wait in the water. I don't want to. Miriam, go and wait in the water. I don't want to. She clearly had this incredible relationship with her mother, but she knew what to say. So when she sees Pharaoh's daughter, who represents power, wealth, corruption, and beauty, and authority, Miriam could have shrunk back. Okay, but instead she doesn't. She steps forward towards power and to the potential threat. And the deliverance of the next generation, unbeknownst to her, lays on her shoulder and her decision to do the right thing. So she saved her people. So opportunity means preparation. We have momentum. Okay. Miriam saw a partial story, but was compelled to act now. And what we were talking about earlier is we have no time to delay. We have to act now and step towards power. Thank God that she did. So all 5 women powerfully resisted in their own way, and they refused to take part in evil in their context. All disobeyed orders from governments and those in power directly over them. Take that in for a minute. All of them disobeyed orders from their government. This is in the church what you'll often hear. I hear this, Rachie, how can you do that? That's breaking the law. Well, actually, we have a higher law, and this is something we need to really get into our bones. All lied. All of them lied to some degree. All took a deep breath and stepped forward and held their nerve, and all pleased God. Now, resistance, my friends, of evil is a holy act. Standing up for justice for the climate is a holy act. Making changes in your own lives, that is a holy act. Putting sustainable living at the centre is a holy act. Saying no to ... in your context is a holy act. We need to be able to look these 5 women in the face and tell them that we too are protecting the most vulnerable, even if we aren't successful, because like them, we know it's the morally right thing to do. Even if we fail to stop the climate emergency, we will go down with dignity, because dignity comes from acting justly, loving mercy, and walking humbly. And there is no other way. So the two questions that I'm posing for discussion are these. When we view the future of the climate, how do we stop falling into despair? How do we keep moving forward and acting even when humanly we know our chances of changing government policies are incredibly slim? So that's that first question. How do we stop falling into despair when we see what we're up against? And the second question I've got here is, what is stopping you personally and your churches stepping up and speaking up? What is stopping you personally from stepping up and speaking up, and what is stopping your church context? I just want to end with a quote from Brené Brown. She says this: we all need strong backs, soft fronts, and wild hearts. And we need that more than ever. Strong backs to know who we are in God, why we're here for this moment. Soft fronts as we approach the other, soft fronts as we approach those who are scared or immobilized, whatever. And the wild heart of the sacred imagination to see and imagine what this planet could be like if we, by the grace of God, succeed.